We're here today to talk about trust and principled humanitarian action, their interplay, and the factors that contribute to eroding and promoting both. I know that we're at a watershed moment in time in terms of trust with external actors, but we actually want to zoom in today about trust within the system and what we can do to strengthen it. Trust is the foundation of all successful human endeavors, whether it's a transaction, whether it's an organization, whether it's collective action. Some people say that trust is an instinct, others say it's a choice. We have to give trust in order to build trust. The research shows that we're prepared to trust someone based on their predictability, on their sincerity, on their integrity, but also on how much empathy they give us and respect. Do they make us feel heard? Do they make us feel listened to? Trust can be built over time. It can be destroyed in an instant. Once it's gone, it's extremely difficult to rebuild. For humanitarian leaders, the times when trust is most at threat is when we're faced with a humanitarian dilemma. Dilemmas are situations that challenge the humanitarian principles. They challenge our organizations, they challenge our reputations, they challenge our sense of right and wrong. I think we've all experienced them, but some of the ones that are very common are around, should we speak up about this access denial, or should we stay silent and protect the precious access that we have? Should we accept funding from governments that are providing weapons to governments that are killing civilians? Should we criticize them and possibly risk our organizational sustainability and programs to millions of people? We have to make a decision, and no option comes without some kind of negative consequence, some kind of risk. And deciding how to dissolve these dilemmas can really keep us awake at night. They test us. I know I've had many sleepless nights myself, both during the time when I'm making the decision and in reflection afterwards, sometimes accompanied with a good bit of shame. Did I do the right thing? How we choose to respond to these dilemmas can break trust, or it can build it. And we have all kinds of constituencies to please, not just affected communities, but our donors, our boards, our staff, and also the wider humanitarian community. As humanitarians, we all want to make the best decision that does the most amount of good and the least amount of harm, of course. But how do we know what the best decision is? And what are the processes and systems that we need in place in order to make a good decision? So these are questions that the Principled Humanitarian Action Committee and I have been discussing over the last few months. And the representatives on this panel, well, they're representatives of the group. The wider group is on screen. So we've been meeting every 2 weeks since about October to discuss these questions. The initiative was started by Myrno and DRC on their request, and I jumped at it. Dilemmas are these big, sticky questions, and I thought, how can I do better when making a decision? What can I learn from the community? But I also was very nervous about having these conversations, because talking about principles can be really divided, really divisive. It can be very polarizing. People can have very strong opinions, and the world is polarized enough without having another divisive conversation. Instead, it's actually been some of the best discussions that I've had in my professional career. The group have been extremely engaged. It's been very vulnerable. We've listened to each other respectfully. We've heard very different points of views, and I've learned so much about the rationale that people can't use in order to make a decision. So I'd like to introduce, without any further ado, Ed Schenkenberg from here, Geneva. Our new chair, Nemo Hassan. This wasn't planned, it just happens to be a benefit. Rehan Zahid from CCHN, Maria Duncan from IRC, Myrno Pasquale from DRC, and Kiran Kathari from Save the Children. And they're representative of the group today. So, without any further ado, I want to go over to Myrno to give more of a background. Actually, sorry, I just have to admit I've lost my glasses somewhere, and so I'm really struggling to follow my text. Okay. But I wanted to ask you a few quick questions first, just to get a sense in the room of where you are at in terms of your experiences with dilemmas. And I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if it's a yes, to do jazz hands if it's a maybe, and just to keep your hands down if it's a no, okay? So in the first question is, hands up if you've ever had to make a difficult decision in the face of a humanitarian dilemma. So a good bit of the room, okay, thank you. Hands up if the decision had unintended or negative consequences. Yeah, yeah. Hands up if you've ever felt judged for the decision that you took. Yeah. And hands up if you've ever judged somebody else for the decision that they took. Yes. Hands up if you've ever felt lonely or isolated, either during the time you were making the decision or after you took the decision. Yes. And hands up if you've ever reached out to other NGOs to help you navigate that decision. Yeah, less so. Okay, so quite common experiences in the room. Okay, brilliant. Right, I'm going to go over to Myrno now and let him introduce where did the idea come from, what we've sort of given overview of the background of the discussions and yeah, the key findings there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eileen. So I'm going to very quickly attempt to summarize 3 pieces of research, which is really the evidence base that led to the steering committee, and then frame a bit of the problem and the assumptions going into the steering committee in the next couple of minutes. These pieces of research, I'm going to do a very, very, very short summary. They're extremely nuanced and very good, and I recommend you to have a look at them. But it really kicked off in Iraq in 2017. It was a piece of research conducted by here Geneva. And NRC had facilitated that. And this piece of research looked at how humanitarian agencies were thinking and utilizing humanitarian principles within the response within Iraq. It was not necessarily looking at the coordination space. It was really around how individual agencies respond within this context. And it found that although a lot of agencies consider the principles, it's core to their everyday operation, or they think about them. Oftentimes this is done in unstructured, undocumented, not so transparent ways. But then additionally, how we utilize the principles diverge greatly in how we see them. Some agencies might reference the principles as to reasons why they might go to a particular place to pursue the humanity principle, for example. And other agencies for that same location would reference the principles as to reasons why they would not go there. We look at principles either as rules or as ideals or as things that can help frame the way that we operate decision-making, a compass in a way. And the problem that was really highlighted was that we diverge on the use and the understanding. And maybe the understanding that we think that we have is not as widespread as we think, and it's not as common as we think. Building upon that, in Yemen in 2021, here Geneva also published a piece of research that looked more at the coordination space. So in Yemen, we were faced with a lot of challenges. We had these big dilemmas imposed on the humanitarian community. And at times, we would develop a common position, and we would overcome that dilemma. It would work. And sometimes we would develop a common position, and very quickly it would fall apart. Although everyone agreeing to do one thing, people started to do other things and then hide and not talk about it. And then other times we were just unable to develop a common position because it's so challenging. And the source of that problem was really the research found was just a lack of trust and a lack of communication amongst agencies. Although everyone agreed that coordination is and could be a tool to overcome these challenges, we were unable to do that. It was captured very much in the frame of the prisoner's dilemma, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but having 2 prisoners, despite knowing that if they're able to coordinate on something, they'll have a better outcome for both of them. But if they're unable to communicate, they will pursue their own rational, individualistic goals, even though knowing it would be better if they coordinated. And within the humanitarian space, that translates into individual agencies pursuing their own agendas, their own funding opportunities, or whatever it might be, despite knowing that in coordination, we would be able to to achieve a better outcome for everybody. And the solution to that is really, again, meaningful exchange and building that trust. Moving on to Afghanistan, piece of research published in 2023, lead researcher with Ashley Jackson. And this, again, built upon these pieces of research and pushed it a little bit further. And I think the Afghanistan research really looked at the external factors, the environment that we operate in, the humanitarian community, not just the community, but the way that we work, the sector, really pushes back, is not enabling of principled, coordinated decisions oftentimes for things that we might not always think. First off, the environments we operate in are extremely complicated, right? These are just really hard to do. Secondly, the way that funding is allocated, donors are going to fund agencies that can operate, and sometimes to maintain principle, you're going to slow down your operations. And so there's this, at least a perception of competition that might degrade an ability to coordinate. Just the field to senior staff, even if you do come to a common position within your own agency, trying to get multiple bases, multiple field teams that are really the ones facing these dilemmas on a day-to-day basis, that's incredibly difficult, and recognizing that. And then there's huge dynamics between what local organizations and international organizations, how they perceive these and their ability to overcome them. And then finally, I think, and I'm summarizing very, very quickly, but it recognized that within the humanitarian community, we have a huge diverse range of actors that have a differing range of values and principles that they guide their actions. Not everyone is just operating under the 4 humanitarian principles. Those might be the most common, but other agencies have other additional principles or values that they utilize to frame how they operate within a complex space. And then trying to pull all that together in a coordination is very hard. So a couple conclusions on the research. First off, principles matter. We think about them often, and we utilize them to justify actions that we're taking. But we vastly overestimate to the extent that everyone can speak to the principles with nuance, and then we even really more overestimate that how common our understanding is of their use, how we utilize them, and then we assume that we should all come to the same conclusion in the face of a dilemma, which by the very nature of a dilemma, we will not. 2 people utilizing principles could come to very different ways forward in the face of a dilemma and then justify very intelligently why they do that. Secondly, that the perception of humanitarian agencies is vastly different than what we think of ourselves. Communities and authorities do not perceive us as principled as we would like. Thirdly, and the coordination, everyone believes in it, or at least people think that coordination can help, but we're struggling. And the reason why we're struggling is that lack of trust, that lack of relationship, that communication that's there. That seems to be a root cause that we need to overcome. But also that there's a huge opportunity here. We have cases when coordination has been really effective to overcome dilemmas. We have various organizations with various strengths and a diversity of approaches that if we can coordinate together and work together, we can achieve the most principled outcome in the end, in the aggregate of all the humanitarian actors that are within a space. I'm going to wrap up on the kind of my framing of the problem and the assumptions. Is that okay, Aileen? We still have a couple minutes. Yeah. Okay.
So we wanted to test our assumptions as well. Myrna's going to talk through them. But if you could take a moment to fill in the Mentimeter slide, and the results will start popping up as well. You can log on to to the survey by typing in menti.com and putting in the code 46121013. We really want to hear from you as much as possible. I know we're in a lecture hall situation, but we're not here to lecture you on principles or pretend we have all the answers. But yes, back to you, Myrna.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think that we have 3 problems that we need to overcome. In varying extents. Do we have a will problem? Is there a problem here about and I don't think that we really do have a very big will problem. I think people want to be principled. People want to coordinate. They believe that could be better, but there's not necessarily a will or a belief that it can at the moment, but we want to do that. And so I think that's a good starting off point. We'd be in a really bad place if we were trying to convince everyone that we should be principled, but we're not there. We're beyond that. I think secondly, we have a technical problem, right? Like this is just really hard, and maybe the right tool, facilitation guidance, things like this can help us be more transparent, more documented. We can have a process that can help us get onto the same page and break down those communication barriers. And I think that that's, that we can achieve that. We can come up with a tool, a facilitation guidance. That's not going to solve everything, but it can help. And I think the main problem that we have is a trust problem. That even if we had the best tool, even if we had all the will, the relationships, the things that kind of push back against us, that disincentivizes being open, transparent, and trusting, we need to really work and unpack that. And I think this is where the steering committee is kind of kicking off and going. And I think we have two assumptions that we need to be careful about as well, dangerous pitfalls. The first one being this assumption that all or nothing is the way to go. If either we get everyone on board and it will work, or if we don't get everyone on board, let's not waste the time to coordinate. And I think that's very dangerous. I don't think it's possible, and I think that it's actually better to have a diversity of approaches and how we go about this. And then secondly, this idea of the slippery slope, I think is a dangerous one, because we could utilize this one to promote coordination or to not. Is that, if we crack once, the authorities are going to get to know. We have no grounding to stand on. We've lost our credibility, and we won't be able to crawl back. We could utilize that argument to push for coordination. We could utilize that argument to say, nah, there's no point in doing it. And I think that's also dangerous. I think we can. We've been operating in these contexts for decades sometimes. Of course, we're going to go through ebbs and flows of our ability to be principled, to have relationships with interlocutors that promotes what we want to do. And I think it's dangerous to assume that once we've lost our chance to crawl back. We can crawl back. And so that's kind of my opening statement.
And I think your assumptions hold up. And, the overall very high ratings. The lower one slightly is that I trust that other NGOs are as committed to upholding the principles as my agency. And that's one of the really interesting things about trust, is that we all trust ourselves. When the research shows, we all trust ourselves to be more principled than everybody else. And everybody rates themselves higher than other agencies or other people. So that's very normal. I'm going to go over to Rehan now. Thank you, Myrno, and ask, what are the major challenges that you've seen from navigating dilemmas and identifying principled positions, and why do we make compromises?
Thank you, Eileen. Before I go ahead, I think something Jamie alluded to, and Myrno as well, I think the purpose of being here today is how to strengthen that collective response. I think we all acknowledge, even as we sit here today, we have colleagues in Gaza, we have colleagues in Kabul making impossible choices, right? So this is not easy, and the purpose is not to critique for the sake of critique, but how can we improve these things so we can support our frontline staff and make more better and informed decisions where risk is shared, where the goals are more aligned, and the responses at the end of the day for the people we serve are strengthened as well, right? So with that, I think the first answer on why our dilemma is harder, because every day we are facing more and more difficult challenges. Right? I think that's part of the reality that we're all dealing with. At the CCHN, we support 7,000 frontline humanitarian negotiators day in, day out. What do we hear? There's a sea of bad choices, and the struggle is to pick the least worst choice. That is the day-to-day of what we're trying to navigate, right? So I think the first and foremost point here is things are getting harder. The choices are getting more and more difficult, and far less and far few. So we will make compromises, and that's okay too. I think in the spirit of the steering committee as well, or creating safe spaces for dialogue across organizations, it is extremely important that we start discussing and talking about these things, because collectively we may find solutions to them, because individually, if we are divided, our stakeholders or the counterparts are not stakeholders that we deal with also exploit those differences, right? And we see that every day in the field. So I think a couple of other thoughts in that positive critique, if you will. What we see and hear from a frontline perspective is a trend as well where the frontliners often don't feel a commitment or support from within their organizations first as well, right? So are the structures, we talk a lot about risk transfer from donors to us as organizations, but there's a second set of a risk transfer sometimes that's happening within organizations to more frontline staff, right? So the first time I ever negotiated with a non-state armed actor, I was sitting in a room and a decision was made that it would be me because I was junior enough that the organization could later deny that a staff member went rogue, and we did it anyway, right? So things are better. We're not 10, 15 years ago. There's a lot more acknowledgement. Panels like this exist. The steering committee exists. The CCHN exists. So we're moving forward. But yes, we are receivers of that risk transference, but we are also providing them. Till last year, we had colleagues somewhere in the Sahel asked to take leave, go in their private cars because the organization has a no contact policy, right? So they are going in their private capacity to negotiate. They don't have red lines given by their mandator. They don't have a framework, and they're asked to go make a deal, and no one wants to know about it, right? So this is a bit the reality as well. It's not as pervasive as it used to be, but it still very much exists, right? And step by step, I think part of dialogues like this, honesty and exchanging will help us move forward. The second one is a bit of, and we all are, including me, but is a bit of self-righteousness as well, right? I think at some point, and I'm seeing the results as well, and as the assumption that Myrno said, we all want to be principled, right? We all want to follow these principles. But at some point, I think they became very nice things that we print out, we make infographics of, and we stick them in our offices, in our walls, or make cards and put them in our pockets, right? If it's an exercise of me going and saying, I am neutral, I am neutral, I am neutral, if that is what was going to make us neutral, I think we would all be fine, right? But it's also about how we take these concepts and we apply them on a day-to-day basis. That doesn't mean they're absolute. I'm not going to get in that debate. That doesn't mean there isn't a tension amongst them, right? So we talk about, do we have a framework to work through our dilemmas? We do. It's called the Humanitarian Principles. They've been distilled, but they're practical tools, right? They're not normative statements. They're not taglines. They are essentially practical tools to help guide you to make those difficult compromises. With that, so why does that not work? If we all believe in them, we know about them, because we don't capacitate our staff to be able to work through those dilemmas. Right? So we all get a copy, we sign a code of conduct, we sign a charter, we are committed to XYZ things, but we get finance training, we get training on risk assurance, we get training on other things, right? So if we're expecting someone to do surgery, he better have trained as a surgeon. If we're expecting to send someone, again, my first negotiation, I fell on the floor on the phone. Because the guy was like, I am General XYZ, who the hell am I speaking with? And the next thing I knew is I just quietly sat down on the ground and said, hello, this is Rehan, right? No training, no nothing. So we send our staff out day in and day out. What is the support we are providing them to be able to deal with, to cope with situations like this as well? Part of the self-righteousness, I think also we need to be careful about, and this goes for me again with honesty, right? We were having a discussion with some forum coordinators yesterday, and we agreed that some of the things we're talking about may not be practical in the field anymore, but to the very least, we need to be honest about them, right? I notice here we've added the concept, and it's everywhere, of principled humanitarian action. Why do we even need to mention principled humanitarian action?
Should we check?
Sorry?
Should we check?
We should.
Oh,
because, I mean, should there be any other type of humanitarian action? It is an inbuilt thing, right? So I think we're, in this debate of their ideals, we're trying to normalize new things, and we should not. just on that point, last point on that one is, I think honesty with ourselves is first and foremost important. Trust within our organizations is extremely important, and that will then enable us to build this trust across organizations as well, right? If we are accepting, and Eileen mentioned this as well, if we're accepting, if we're accepting resources from a belligerent and a party to the conflict, and we still somehow think, operating in that environment, that we are neutral, and then we are surprised why one party is shooting at us, I think there's time for some exploration as well. And the last point is about building a culture of being principled, right? So these dilemmas are difficult. We evaluate many other things. We evaluate the impact of our programs. I am not aware of many examples where we have evaluated or self-questioned, are we being principled in a particular place, right? Systematically going back and looking at these things and questioning how our responses are running as well, right? So I think we should be tearing our hair out. We should be having lively debates with our colleagues, as we do on fundraising, as we do on other topics, about putting our heads together on these are the choices confronting us, and how do we work through them? And I've seen very few organizations where that happens actively as part of an ethos, as part of a culture. And the last point I think I will make is there is power in the collective, right? And one of the reasons why I was very excited to join the CCHN, because it can be very, very lonely. And we spoke about criticism as well, and with the hands raised as well. It can be a very, very lonely endeavor to work through some of these dilemmas, right? So we need more safe spaces. We need more initiatives where at least we can share and learn from some of these practices, but that has to first start with being honest with ourselves.
Thank you so much. Great, and thank you so much for filling in the question. I'm not sure if we're going to get the right answer confirmed on the screen. The majority of you have got the right answer, and thank you so much. It is the principle of impartiality is to provide relief assistance on the basis of need alone, and so this is the standard definition. And what we found is across workshops, I've run this with several organizations, with NGO fora, and I've found that there is a real lack of understanding of what the principles mean. And if we don't know what the principles are and aren't fluent with them, it's very hard to explain them to our staff. But beyond the sort of key headings of definitions, it gets really sticky trying to figure out what does impartiality look like in this context? What does neutrality look like in this context? And that is where the discussion really needs to come in. But as you can see for yourselves, this is a room of humanitarian leaders, and we are struggling to define them ourselves. And I'm not here to judge. I have learned a lot technically over the last few months as well, but it is a conversation because it's our ethics, and how we show up to engage externally. It's really important that we're deeply familiar. So Maria, over to you. What are, going back to the question, what are your major challenges for navigating dilemmas?
Yeah, I mean, the first problem is that you asked us to prioritize, and we're humanitarians, and that's pretty impossible. But I was reflecting on the will question as well, and how trust and will are so inextricably linked. And I think that even though we want there to be a will, I think we're making a big assumption there. I think the incentive structures in the sector in which we work do not always facilitate that, and that's at an organisational and an individual level. So thinking about the speed of our response, spending money, compliance measures, even at kind of individual levels about raising dilemmas, we still have joint operating principles that have punitive language about accountability and reporting, and so we're not encouraging staff to speak out either. And I think that those are some of the barriers then that, to getting the right people in the room, keeping the right people in the room, and creating the space that we've talked about, and having the time, and, encouraging transparency around these discussions. And I think for IRC, we're really learning as we go. I mean, one thing we did do a couple of years before I joined the organisation in this role was create an advisory committee for humanitarian ethics. What we learnt from that was we were actually taking the decision-making away from where the dilemma was raised. So we're kind of decontextualising it, and we're also, it's threatening. It's threatening for teams if you take decisions away from normal channels. And so that actually, didn't work, and we learnt that. And so I think what we're trying to do now is really encourage and empower decision-making and strengthen existing channels and existing leaders. And when I say leaders, at all levels. At the program site level, what decision can they take? What decision needs to be escalated to a field coordinator? And so on and so forth. And if you empower that, then one is to empower that, and then the next one is to, when you do escalate, don't remove them from the conversation, so that you keep the context and you make sure the risks of the decisions are managed at all levels. So I think that that's something we're really, really learning. And it is difficult because, we don't necessarily have the time and the resources in an emergency. And so I think that if we talked about building a culture of it, if we just be a little bit better each time at doing it, there'll be a little bit more trust in staff and a bit more consistency. Oh, well, if I raise this, like last time, I was included in the conversation, so there's a good chance I'll be included again. So I think that in the way we do things, it will also build the trust and create that culture. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the last thing we're aiming for is another governance, requirement. But Kieran, it'd be great to hear your reflections on this too.
Oh, thanks. Just going back to what was being said, internally within SAVE, we have a policy, and my colleague Salar is kind of our global lead, and he sits in the room with us when we're talking about a dilemma, and those rooms tend to be on Teams or Skype, and then in those situations there's somebody who's in a very, very tough situation. It could be a country director, or it could be a field office manager, and they're asking us, like, hey, what do I do here? And there's been a coup in the country, and tomorrow morning I've got to go and negotiate with the minister, and it so happens that we've had consistent dealings with this minister because she used to be, or he used to be, the Minister of Development. We've done some work, and SAVE has this dual mandate. And in that kind of situation, you're like, how do you advise somebody overnight? I recognize a lot of the challenges that Maria said. They want the support, but they want the freedom to know that they've got the decision under control, and you're able to give that to them with some kind of framework. And I know that Myrno has worked with my colleague Salar, and that the idea of opening up that space, even within this conversation, for us to know that, the others are facing similar challenges is kind of quite good. So, that's in real-time discussion with your colleagues. You're trying to tell the decision maker, the country director or the field office manager, that they're okay, they've got the support of the system. So that's really good, right? Because you're out there operating. And I recognize that. I really like how Maria put it just now, which is, if you take it away, it's a threat, because you're undermining everything, you're slowing down the actions, and we need that more and more because we're facing complex challenges. And for me, it's, if you were to ask me what's the biggest, where are you leaning, and it's going to come up later as well, but for me it's, where am I coming from? I'm asking the question, can we do it? Is it fair? Is what we're doing fair? Is it right that they're doing this? And then I'm a lawyer, so you'll hear that a lot in kind of how I balance things. But then I think about humanity a lot, and trust. And in a crisis situation where I've reached out to Rehan the first time in a very recent crisis moment, I've got relationships with CCHN, and I value those, but I hadn't dealt with Rehan in a crisis moment. And I asked the person, do you trust Rehan? Because I'm putting myself out here with privileged information that I've gotten from another source. And asking that question, it really brings it, like, I'm coming from the point of view of humanity. I know that he's coming from the point of view of humanity, and I know how the organizations are functioning. In a crisis moment, just asking that question is, of somebody that I trust. Do you trust them in this moment, given what I've got going on? And they know what I've got going on. So it comes down to this as well, right? And I do it internally within my organization, but I also do it outside. So, yeah.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Yes, absolutely. And there's a huge vulnerability there, and such a risk that we're taking. And just reflecting what you're saying around, the risks that we're putting on staff, and something that William from Sphere was saying at our group on Tuesday was just that, there really is this whole statement of doing no harm is actually very problematic. All we can achieve is doing the least harm in these moments, and this whole issue of risk transfer on staff is massive. Nemo, what are your reflections so far?
Good morning. Really great discussion, listening intently here. I was just reflecting back on the day-to-day decisions that we have to make, either as the forum or with our partners, either NGOs or INGOs. All of these frameworks are there. We have, when you mentioned about joint operating principles, we have it. It's endorsed by the HCT. It's circulated, it's sent. Now, is it followed? Does everybody read, or has the time to read? And does everybody have time to even think and consult these documents that we have when you have to make a decision or you're faced with a dilemma in a particular context? So those are and we have these coordination forums that sometimes we could utilize better to come to those consensus. But as it was said earlier, do you go partially? Do you need everybody to sign on? In some of the issues that we raised at the consortia, it takes a long time to get sign-offs and get people on board. And so sometimes we use our own logo and not the members' logos. So that's one way of us navigating through these long processes of getting everybody on board. Even if they agree in the room, do they agree externally? Because if you have to put a statement out, everybody doesn't necessarily agree with having their logo because of risks, associated risks, or perceived risks as well. But it really is important to ensure that, I was also thinking as you were discussing when I was doing implementation, the main emails and reminders that you get is about burn rates. Get the money fast, get it going fast so we can get the next tranche of money. But those discussions about the principles, or it doesn't come into staff meetings, it doesn't come into country office meetings, it really doesn't come into, it's not a discussion that happens or a dialogue that happens on time. And even as you were saying, that training, that it's not given to the staff. So I think one way of us addressing and ensuring that internally each organization is having that conversation, and its support that can be given to the field is to ensure that you're having that dialogue and giving people options of what they can do if they face certain dilemmas as well. I think that would be one key. If we're constantly having that dialogue, constantly having that conversation is one thing. Another one is definitely empowering the platforms that we have collectively and ensuring that we are definitely having that as a safe space, but also working through our dilemmas through those already structured conversations as well. But I do understand there's always a struggle between what you need to get going, what you have to implement, to the additional things that, although very important, you don't get accounted for, you not get rewarded for, nobody measures your performance based on how you resolve the dilemmas, and did you actually involve and worked with did you work collaboratively? So I think is building into our system that maybe will guide and empower our individual staffs as well as working together across the sector that we're operating in. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And actually, what you said there just really resonated with me around the use of the forum logo. And I was the Ethiopia Forum director for a while, and we weren't a registered forum. And just that sort of it's just you. As a forum coordinator, you can feel so vulnerable and exposed when you're the sort of champion of a particular position representing the NGO community. And for sort of less formal structures in particular, it's really challenging to know what your mandate is from all of your members. And I was saying this to a hostage negotiator, former hostage negotiator that Rayhan brought into our meeting of the week. We were talking about how isolated you can feel when you're making these decisions. And he said, well, and with no judgment, he's the most reassuring person in the world. I was very impressed. But he was saying, listen, it means you haven't checked enough in with people to really get confirmation and sign off on your decision. And that's hard to do sometimes when you're with an NGO collective, but that need to be really explicit about, do I have the mandate here to, go and negotiate with the host government or put this statement out? It was a really stressful dilemma for me. Ed, over to you. So Ed is here Geneva have recently published an excellent interagency humanitarian evaluation on Ethiopia and the response there. And as I said, I was forum director there during those early months of the Tigray crisis. And he found, the evaluation found that the dynamic within the humanitarian country team was dysfunctional. And I think that really, describes the situation well. There was an absence of trust. There was little sense of a common goal. Meetings were more like webinars. And there was no real space to important discussions around access, around the application of principles. And as team members of the HCT, we're all responsible for that dynamic, including me, so I take ownership. But so much of the tone is, of course, set by the chairs. I will say that many of us, as the evaluation found, were out of our depth. Most of our background was in recovery and development work, and we were suddenly plunged into this massive crisis where 6 million people were cut off from their coping strategies and also from humanitarian assistance. And the scale was staggering. And also the levels of polarization and fear were intense. So as leaders, none of us wanted to admit that we were out of our depth. And which was a problem because we actually needed each other's help, and a lot of that support network would have been really helpful to have. Those discussions were absolutely vital. There were moments of support, but mostly there was silence, there was a disconnect, there was a withdrawal. As I said, I felt isolated and exposed at times. So recently, I asked the forum coordinators if this was a similar experience for them. What their experiences on HCT were like, and hopefully I can get the slide coming up, the next presentation slide, please. Or to see if it was just me, and the answer is it was overwhelmingly not me. So we have here the responses, 25 responses from INGO forum coordinators, and the white boxes from national NGO forum coordinators who are participating on HCT to sort of describe in one word what their experiences of the meeting was. And with very few exceptions, we do see, consulted in 1 or 2 cases, most people are feeling extremely frustrated, bored, demotivated. And this is supposed to be the most important meeting in the country. We're talking about life and death matters, and I know it sounds glib to say you're bored, but that just goes to show that the quality of the conversation and the sort of level of discussion is not really happening, and that it is much more of a webinar experience. Very few people admit their mistakes. We're not sharing risks together. And not feeling that psychological safety that's absolutely essential. But Ed, I wanted to go back to you on this. Why is trust? I'm sorry, actually, just instead of just pointing the finger at the UN, which is easy to do, I also wanted to ask you about your experiences with engaging with different NGOs and how you're feeling about that. So interesting. That's not the one that I was hoping to come up. Can we go to the next slide, please? Sorry. So it's a rate these statements slide, please. But Ed, in the meantime, why is trust important for principled humanitarian action? And can trust between humanitarian agencies help us secure better outcomes for crisis-affected people?
Thanks, Eileen. I think what the colleagues already on the panel pointed out very well, the link between the principles and trust is precisely around identity, in the sense of knowing yourself and letting yourself be known by others. So introducing yourself, explaining where you come from. I mean, it's a normal thing. It's a thing of all everyday life, so to speak. And showing who you are creates a degree of predictability when I meet you next time. And so linking that to principles, the predictability element, I want ICRC, I mean, it's funny, we have spoken about principles, humanitarian action, without necessarily going into the principles, but I want ICRC to stress neutrality. That's how I know ICRC. I want MSF to question that neutrality because of their témoignage or advocacy. I want Oxfam, or I expect Oxfam at least, to sort of doubt that neutrality because indeed of their work on social justice. And looking at the room, many of you I know would even say, well, for us it's not 4 principles. There's participation, there's do no harm, there's solidarity. So actually we don't have 4 principles, we have 7 or 8 or even more. But who am I to judge in that sense? What I want exactly is having that discussion with you. It opens a dialogue that we so desperately need, and that I think already many of you pointed to here on the panel, and that happens at the same time so rarely. There indeed is a degree of embarrassment for having that, for exposing yourself in the context of, certainly in the context of a humanitarian country team, but even when you're amongst yourself in an NGO forum or NGO coalition. So, Eileen, I think the work that you and Mirno started in that sense is really brilliant, much, much needed to exactly have that conversation. Discussions in coordination meetings, whether they're clusters, humanitarian country teams, they're entirely technical. They're away from the values. I mean, it's insane, really. So what I saw in that sense, I saw exactly that in Ethiopia. For those of you looking up on our website, the evaluation is not yet out. In this safe space, among you, I see very familiar faces. For some of you, you are less familiar to me. I'm happy to say a few things about it. What I saw there was indeed the opposite of trust. And actually, this may be a perception on my part, but the moment I hear, and this was not just Ethiopia, it's everywhere. The moment I hear a UN official say, we're all delivering principled humanitarian action, actually that creates the opposite of trust on my part. It creates suspicion. How do I know that you're delivering principled humanitarian action? And precisely when I see you way too close with a government which is actually committing serious violations of human rights, breaches of IHL, and I see the UN in a very, very close relationship with that government, I become even more suspicious. And this is exactly what happened in Ethiopia. The humanitarian country team in November, so for those of you not entirely familiar, the blockade, the siege that we all see at the moment in Gaza, 2 years ago, a very similar thing happened in the north of Ethiopia. For 2 years, that was basically a blockade. But the big difference with Gaza is, in this situation, it was primarily the government of Ethiopia itself that was responsible for it, with whom the UN was very, very close. It agreed, the humanitarian country team agreed on a set of operational principles. But guess what? The humanitarian resident coordinator agreed on, she made an agreement with the government, which even felt, the joint operating principles that were agreed by the humanitarian country team were okay. They're not a magic bullet. They weren't perfect, but at least there was something there. Except the document wasn't used at all. Worse, the humanitarian coordinator went to the government and actually signed a document that doesn't mention any humanitarian principles, that falls below everything, and there wasn't a legal review on it in the UN. So I mean, that immediately, of course, certainly sitting here as an evaluator now, creates huge suspicion on my part. What went on there? Story doesn't end there, because obviously the report that is going to come out probably by the end of this month addresses this issue. But it doesn't stop there, the story, and I'm more than enough evidence that I have in terms of the way the UN seriously has been compromised in this situation. So in the meantime, the senior person in the country has changed. There is a new humanitarian coordinator. The person is even said to be one of the better ones. Well, this is what I got back just now on the report last week. Another point that could come out more clearly in the report, this is a draft report that has been circulated, was that the UN was not impartial during the war. And in fact, first of all, actually, the humanitarian coordinator there confuses impartiality with neutrality.
Some other people do as well.
What he basically does in this message, he apologizes for the statements. For a long time, the UN was relatively silent on the situation. In the end, there were a number of statements, particularly from Dr. Tedros, the head of WHO. And in fact, what the humanitarian coordinator now is doing in the country, and it's disgusting. I don't have another word for it. He's apologizing to the government for what Tedros said at the time. I read you what Tedros said, because I had to look it up again. Nowhere in the world, and this, I already made the parallel with Gaza. Gaza was very much in the news. Tigray hardly in the news because all the journalists were kicked out of the country, basically. Nowhere in the world would you see this level of cruelty where a government punishes 6 million of its people for more than 21 months by denying them basic services. Now, if you have to apologize as UN for this, you're sincerely denying your mandate. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ed. Now, I'm sorry about the slight technical challenge we had there, but thank you for feeding into the statements and really interesting results, and particularly around the sharing of information. So a bit of hesitancy there, and yet the strong will to help other NGOs if they experience difficulties. So that's super interesting. And I love the actually really high score on that. I am impressed when an NGO admits a mistake. It shows accountability and leadership. So that's very positive. Maria, do you have any reflections there you want to add as well?
Sure.
Sorry, I'll give you the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I would build off that exact point, I think, about sharing information and coordination. I think we've kind of, like we've drummed neutrality or drummed a policy into our teams, I think we've also done the same with what coordination looks like. We think of it as a mechanism, and I think that's really problematic that we, like I was just in Myanmar and talking to the teams about, but I don't feel comfortable sharing in this forum. And it was like coordination can also happen over chai, like with one other NGO. Like it can build up. I'm not saying that we take it away from those mechanisms, but I say that that's not the only space that we can share information and share how we got to a decision. That's the other thing that I think is another pitfall here that we've talked a lot about in this group, is that we kind of assume that we all have the same objective. Principled action actually isn't common positions. If I'm a health actor, it is unprincipled that I would have the same position as someone that is doing, women's empowerment, because I will be willing to compromise more for trauma response or something like that. It's about how we discuss as NGOs what were the criteria for our decision making and how we got to those decisions, so that we can then, as NGOs, mitigate or manage the risk that that decision might have on our NGO and vice versa. So that might be controversial, but I think we've talked a lot about how it's really discussing the behind the scenes of a decision that's really important.
Thank you so much. Rehan.
Okay, thank you. No, I just want to pick up on what Ed and Maria were just saying and link it previously, I think, on the trust question as well, right? And just building off what was being said on how the principles and the levels of compromises we made too may be different, and I think that's absolutely right. So really, what we want to move towards is more common methodology, I think, in terms of working and navigating through some of these dilemmas that are facing us, because I think at this point in time we can all agree, based on our different donor conditions, based on our mandates, based on X, Y, Z, it's very difficult and far and few where we're going to come on common positions that we can agree on, right? So we need to move away from the position mindset to at least having the same language, the same understanding, and the same methodology in terms of pursuing and unpacking some of these dilemmas, because at least that will give us a common thread where that repeat behavior that Ed was talking about in terms of trust can start being recognized a bit as well. I think the second one, as part of this, is having those safe spaces for dialogue, right? And having them at the field level, them being decentralized, where we may have organizational mandates and institutional considerations, but when frontliners are connecting with frontliners, there is great and amazing conversations and exchanges happening, right? And that builds a more deep-rooted, I think, trust and repeat behavior at an individual level that can then be shared through organizations as well, something we do with our peer-to-peer sharing, with the community practice on frontline negotiators as well, which is excellent, I think. And it's a long-term process, but it builds it ground up. And the last point I wanted to make, and I'm going to take it back a bit to honesty, but also the coordination forms, and pick up on what Nima was saying about the joint operating principles, right? We do peer reviews. We were looking at, an organization's strategy and their operating principles in a particular context. They had 36 red lines, right? 36 lines that they had put out there, and I'm going to borrow from Ed. When I looked at them, I cannot trust them, right? Because that's not a serious document. It may be a good document for their donor. It may be a good document for them to position themselves, but every day for the past 20 years in that context, they know 35 of those 36 are not realistic. It's not going to happen. Right? So if someone puts that out there and says, this is my approach, this is where I draw the line, trust me, I cannot. Right? So I think we need to start differentiating. There are certain things we say, we do, because we have to say them. There's expectations, right or wrong. We have to put in our proposals, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's the reality. Right? And unless and until we create spaces where we can start speaking the truth to each other, it's very, very difficult that we're going to start building trust.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So we're going to go over to a quick discussion now. What we're going to do is we're going to ask everybody to turn around to the people next to them and discuss what can we do as leaders and as organizations to build trust, to support principled action in the face of challenging humanitarian dilemmas. So we're going to take 5 minutes to do that. The question will come up on screen in an instant. And then what we'll do is we'll come back. The panel will reflect themselves, just like a big group work. We'll let the panel go first, and then we're going to hear back from any additions or contradictions from the audience, okay? So hopefully we'll get that slide up. But yeah, the question again is, what can we do as leaders and as organizations to build trust, to support principled action in the face of challenging humanitarian dilemmas? Okay, so 5 minutes to discuss, and then we'll come back, okay? Great. The question that we were discussing there is, what can we do as leaders and as organizations to build trust, to support principled action in the face of challenging humanitarian dilemmas? Nima, would you like to share your reflections?
I go first. We had a completely different conversation here, but but maybe so. I mean, I always say dialogue. I think dialogue is really the basis of building trust. Like, if we understand our commonalities and if we understand our differences, and then maybe we can reach a ground position or a space, or and I would also say that the trust building, it's internal to organizations, but it has to also go external. not only to INGO, but your local partners that you work with. It's really important to build that trust. Not only in addressing the dilemmas, but there's a whole other level of trust that needs to be built with the local partners, and those are the organizations that are part and parcel of the communities and the context, and that can help you. They can sometimes be the part of the problem as well, so you really need to understand the context really well and have that dialogue. So for me, if I have to choose one key word, will be dialogue to build trust. And then, as you said, Eileen, at the beginning, it takes time to build trust, but it can take a moment to break it. So I think we really need to be very careful once you build that trust, then to maintain that trust to ensure that and the last thing that I want to say is putting the affected communities in the center of our thinking, our dialogue, will maybe find a convergence then, because if that's the key denominator, then the how will find the how. So it's really important that our politics and reputations and our growth and our funding takes a second stage, I think, to helping the communities that we are expected to serve.
Thank you so much, Nemo. Mirno.
Yeah, thank you. So very quickly, I think that we have parallel things to do within our organizations and within the coordination space. I think thinking about how we are more transparent and accountable about what those decisions are is essential, and I think documenting them, I think considering the governance of that, who's involved in making those decisions, making sure that communities are part of people we consult on how we can maintain principled programming. But I think regardless if it's internal or external, this actioning real empathy around how we navigate this. The people that are faced with this is not like myself sitting in an HQ. It's our frontline staff members, and really focusing our efforts not so much on you made the wrong decision, but on the environment, which is the context that you're operating in, as well as the humanitarian sector, has put up a lot of roadblocks that put you in a position that you have to make a terrible choice. And we're empathetic to that. And we're here to support you in unpacking the environment around you that's driving that, as opposed to you don't understand what the principles are, or you made the wrong thing, or let's just criticize kind of how we got here. And I think that that's really important that we should, as leaders, should focus on the policy, the environment, to change that, to enable our frontline staff members that are really the ones facing these decisions day to day.
Kieran.
I wasn't expecting to have to say something right now, but I was, yeah, and then I realized that that's what you said to us, that we should be ready to, no, I'm joking, I am ready to say something, sorry. But really what I was, like, in my mind, it's also, I've been in this principled humanitarian action steering committee. I don't know how long or what stage of the process I came in, but one of the things that I figured out, I've mentioned my colleague Salar, and if you get a chance to read him or follow him on LinkedIn, it's completely worthwhile. And the conversations that I've had with Eileen and Mirno, and then listening to what Maria says in the group, and then Ed and Rehan and then Nemo's contributions now, there's a lot of thinking that other people are doing at the same time. And I can, now that I know how Mirno thinks and that he's so thorough in this area, I know that it's good enough for me on certain points that if I just listen to him, I can lean into that. And so if the question is, what should we do? It's kind of also, and we're talking about a common method, and we're talking about sharing compromises. So for me, it's to find the right, we have a lot of language from negotiation, which comes about through good practices, and there's a whole space of work there that it really lends itself to understanding this very quickly. And there's a lot of work that's going on, and there are experts in this room, so speak to them as well. That's really useful. And then a second thing is, if we're looking at compromise, even if we're not able to share the full nature of the compromise, knowing that we're compromising and communicating that is also good. And I've seen that in your notes, right? When we were discussing for this session, but it also has come up many times. And I think there's also trust that comes from not sharing it, and I think that's quite good. And it's come up for me in a few recent examples that this was the case. So there was an advocacy effort around funding of teachers in one location in a protracted conflict, and SAVE funded the teachers, and that undercut the advocacy point. And the punch that we got in the meeting, in a side meeting, a bilateral one, was, why did you go ahead? It's not that they quibbled with the fact that we funded the teachers, it's that we didn't tell them. And that, so I think you made the compromise, you shared, you didn't share. And if you don't share, the lack of information that's there is so it has to do with trust, and it's negative for trust as well. So it's important, I think. Thanks.
Thank you. Ed.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on one point in the sense of, I think Nemo said we had a different conversation, that's true, but we spoke about the work that's ahead of her as chair of ICVA. And what is interesting there, her emphasizing the need for dialogue, exactly creating the safe space. What we apparently still see as a luxury within our world is to talk about what I would call the soft skills, the behaviors. So how do you create that culture? And I know with Lola and a few others in the room have done a lot of work on this in terms of, leadership behavior, listening to each other, all these exercises and so on. And as I said, apparently they're still seen as a luxury. When I looked indeed just recently at the handbook, you already heard me on the humanitarian coordinator in Ethiopia. When I just looked, there's a new handbook, the handbook for humanitarian coordinators has been updated. And it's exactly the example of how we look in the sector. So there's all this knowledge on how do you, it's about contingency planning, preparedness, scale up, all the technical sort of skills. There is zero attention in that handbook in terms of actually how do you work together as a team. So we're so far behind on this. Really need to be much more attention to exactly that element.
Soft skills are the hardest, for sure. Maria.
I think I'm largely going to be reinforcing what my colleagues have said, but it's exactly that. It's to not, first of all, is to not underestimate the value of trust and to not assume that we have it. And so that as leaders, in addition to, addressing those incentive structures and creating an enabling environment, I think that we need to resource very practical ways. So for example, and I can only speak for IRC and even only my team, I don't presume to know that everything the organisation is doing in this space, but we are trying to build up our modules around empathy and communication in our humanitarian negotiation work, so that we are addressing the soft skills, which we just assume people have, and it's a really dangerous assumption. We're trying to kind of create platforms and peer exchanges so that we can discuss dilemmas that we've documented and learn from them, where country programs are facing kind of similar constraints. We're developing a humanitarian leadership program, framework, tool. I don't even know what it looks like because we're developing it with humanitarian leaders, and we're trying to, I think, and the common thread here as well that leaders can support is that it's, encourage learning and support failure. So really trying to take iterative approaches to what we're doing, because there's no silver bullet. There won't be a singular framework, a singular tool. And I think within the complex environments in which we work, if we're expecting that, we're setting ourselves up to fail at best and actually quite dangerous if we try and apply that approach. So just making sure that we are constantly learning and adapting with the approaches that we do develop.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. And actually, that whole organizational support from leadership to fail is so absolutely critical, and it is one of the things I absolutely love about working with ICVA is that my management have repeatedly communicated to me that, Eileen, if you fail, it's okay, we'll chalk that up to learning. But in so many of our organizations and cultures that we work in, that privilege isn't there, or it's not clearly communicated. And I'm hearing so much from staff, particularly frontline staff, particularly around bureaucratic and administrative impediments where they're paying for non-receivable costs to get a document through urgently, and they are really terrified to admit to it and deeply stressed about the compromises that they're making. Rehan, your reflections.
Thank you. Going back on what we can do as leaders in organizations, and I just want to pick on a few things that were said. I think the starting point, and Emo mentioned it as well, is there's exigencies of work, right? We're in the humanitarian realm. There's lives that need to be saved. There's deadlines that need to be met. There's food that needs to be delivered, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we need to do is move from this reactive approach to a proactive approach. Because if we remain in the reactive, we're always going to be trailing behind. When the crisis is afoot, a difficult dilemma is faced with, people want answers. They don't want training. They don't want capacity building. That time has probably sailed past, right? So recognizing the environments in which we work today, we need to invest in these things prior to us needing to do them, right? And that needs to be a conscious choice. And in two fronts, I think. Externally, yes, there's politicization of aid, there's criminalization, there's national laws, et cetera, et cetera. That's important, right? And there is enough advocacy, and there needs to be more to address those things. But I think what is more immediate and in our hands is looking at the internal. And within that, I'll submit two things here. One is we need to start asking ourselves, are our organizations structured, are our offices structured, are our teams structured in a way that allows us to be neutral, for example, right? Or how are we picking those teams, right? Do we have reporting mechanisms in place where we were talking about not taking the decision away from them? What are the dilemmas? What is the mandate of a field negotiator? I've been in instances where I was asked to call headquarters every time. It's really difficult being in Yemen and every 20 minutes telling your counterpart, please wait, let me go call Rome. You know, it just doesn't work this way. We need better structured mechanisms where the lines are clear as to what we can deal on, what we cannot deal on, when do we confer back, and it needs to be transparent. Right? If we leave people to their own devices, we're also sending the signal maybe we don't want to know. And I think the second aspect of it is what I've all spoken about is on the capacity element, right? And I cannot stress that enough, especially for also our partners, right? The national local organizations, there's a lot of risk transfer and subcontracting, et cetera, that happens. Right? We really need to move from transference to sharing, and that includes capacity building. And the last point I wanted to make was soft skills may not be in that manual, but we have the field manual on humanitarian negotiations. I mean, I look at everything from a negotiation lens, because even for me, dilemmas, the number of options we have can be expanded. We can find other options to it if we are doing all the things and following a process to negotiate properly, right? And the field manual doesn't come from Geneva, it comes from practitioners in the field, right? We have really good practices out there, we just don't have mechanisms to share them. Right, and this space for dialogue, it's great. We have a panel here today, but this sharing needs to happen on a constant basis, right? There was a training of trainers for Northwest Syria. They came out to Gaziantep, they went back, they've created their own safe spaces to share, right? So they don't have to come out, they don't need to be online. Maybe these spaces are decentralized. Right, so we need to support the creation of these, because till we don't have this dialogue and learn from each other, I don't think we can move forward.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to hear your thoughts and reflections. Yeah, can my colleagues help with microphones? Who am I going to pick on first? Gloria, just because you're right in front of me.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. Mine is just a small reflection on the conversation, a very interesting one. But one thing that comes to mind is already a very biased, system that we're working in when it comes down to the local organizations. There's all this perception that, national organizations are not working in accordance with the principles, they lack these capacities. There's, a particular way in which the donors and partners, especially UN, INGOs, have already perceived in advance. Now, when we talk about trust, it's also the same conversation. There's already that biased perception right from the beginning. And we're talking about this beautiful terminology that I don't see forthcoming for the longest time possible. And unlike the way it is with our counterparts, we've seen double standards when it comes down to principles. We've seen international NGOs or UN agencies, in great scandals. But that goes, behind the scene. The donor comes, tap you, yeah, good boy, let's, you can adjust here and let's move on. But then the same is not reciprocated for the national organizations. How do we have a much more honest discussion and honest ways of, judging from the same scale?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we had a very good four-member discussion, and it covered Asia Pacific, Africa, South Asia. We had a donor perspective, we had a platform perspective, we had a network perspective, and two things we realized. First, quickly, is that the trust per se is a very broad umbrella, and there was vertical trust, mainly donors, accounts, and funding. There was trust, which is collaborative trust, which is different than accountability trust. And there was, of course, the trust, which is the local trust, vis-a-vis the global trust. And that's something which came up, the discussion. And as a realization, to answer the question, we realized that maybe it's time to look at not the trust per se so much, but the context within which the trust is unfolding, because the role of the state has changed so much in not only last few decades, but last few years, and so has the role of market, whether they are functioning or not functioning, as well as the role of civil society, if at all it is happening in many locations. So in one word, the context of trust has become far more important to act on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe this is also my question. Yeah, this is Nabil from Yemen. Thank you so much. We know that ICVA is not a school, it is a university now for all the humanitarians and the development actors as well. So as we discussed in Brussels the day before yesterday, that there is a need for Nexus Lab, there is a need for global localization centers. And I believe ICVA should be the trailblazer, should be on the driver's seat, because, for example, CHS of today, the announcement of the core humanitarian principles, the new ones, will be announced today. So I think we shouldn't work as far remote islands. It is a time now to be unified, maybe under the umbrella of ICVA, so that these works can be collective, and we can reach to the paradigm shift that we all are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Nabil. Anybody else? Manisha, sorry, who's been hugely involved in leading on an ethical decision-making framework. So, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
En français, merci. Alors, je vais parler en français parce que beaucoup de gens comprennent le français et notre équipe a décidé qu'on parle en français.
Je peux parler en français, Fatou va traduire. Donc tu fais une petite phrase et on traduit.
Il y a les traducteurs. OK, d'accord. Alors,
There's no judgment. Thank you.
voilà, pour notre groupe, on a trouvé que la clé pour créer la confiance, c'est d'abord les dialogues au-delà de nos classifications.
So the critical thing that we said in our group is to create confidence in terms of different levels and classifications.
Oui, alors il faut un dialogue continu et dans toutes les directions.
There has to be a continued dialogue in all directions.
Et nous avons pris l'exemple de la République démocratique du Congo,
And we took the example of DRC, where this gentleman is from,
où les ONG nationales, les ONG internationales et les agences des Nations Unies se retrouvent dans tous les mécanismes de coordination
where national, international NGOs and UN agencies find themselves in all different levels of coordination structures.
et cela a été possible parce que le coordinateur humanitaire et son adjoint ont décidé de,
This was possible because the humanitarian coordinator and the deputy humanitarian coordinator decided
de briser les barrières entre la stratification.
to break down the barriers and the stratification or the sort of ossification that occurred.
Et cela fait que nous avons un club que nous appelons club, où nous retrouvons les forums des ONG internationales, les forums des ONG nationales, la coordination humanitaire et les agences des Nations Unies pour une discussion continue sur tous les sujets.
So we've created something called a club where we find all these different actors, international NGOs, national NGOs, UN agencies, international organizations, where we discuss issues related to coordination.
Et ça fait que même les sujets les plus délicats, on peut les évoquer et discuter et trouver les solutions sans qu'il y ait des préjugés.
We can here raise even the most delicate issues without any judgment and discuss them openly.
Et en guise d'exemple, les ONG nationales qui étaient estimées sans capacité, maintenant on sait qu'il y a des ONG nationales qui ont plus de capacité que les ONG internationales et à qui on confie des leaderships pour certains thèmes.
Okay. So we've found through this dialogue that there are national NGOs that have more capacity than international NGOs, and that we can actually, the confidence can be made or put in them to actually lead.
Et nous pensons que cela vraiment a créé la confiance.
And this has actually created confidence.
Et c'est quelque chose qui améliore énormément maintenant le système humanitaire dans notre pays.
And something that has really greatly improved the humanitarian system in our country.
Ça va.
Ça va? And I'm just...
Thank you.
And I'm just going to add one point to the point that I think Ed raised on soft skills. We do now have values and behaviors on behalf, I work for OCHA, in the new humanitarian coordinator terms of reference. So I'm not sure that's the absolute solution, but it's a good start. And the soft skills, my colleagues in the humanitarian leadership and support section have been dealing a lot with HCT onboarding. So all new HCT members now go through different sessions where the value of soft skills, there is actually an old manual that I think also can be used, which is excellent and honestly was created years ago. And so there is work being done on it. Thank you for that point, and absolutely agree, soft skills are critical.
Thank you. That's great. I volunteered Manisha there, so yeah, thank you. And then Asmat, yeah.
Hi, I'm Manisha Thomas. I'm the part-time representative for the Women's Refugee Commission here in Geneva. Thank you to all the panelists. I think it's been really interesting to hear the different perspectives, but I feel like we haven't really talked about the accountability element that comes in for making those decisions or how we bring that in. And I think that transparency about why decisions are made, when they're made, who makes them, and then sort of how they're communicated are all essential. And I think that's maybe one piece of the puzzle that was missing. And now I'm going to do a shameless plug for the guide that Eileen has just mentioned. So Humanitarian Outcomes did a study around the ethical dilemmas in Afghanistan facing humanitarians following the female aid worker ban in December. And what was very apparent amongst those conversations was that you had the humanitarian principles in tension with each other. And then what you had was a humanitarian country team that just dissolved into chaos and fighting. And it was not only a lack of trust, it was just not being able to see what others were thinking or why they were approaching things. And so it was just a very toxic conversation. So after that study, we've now worked as Humanitarian Outcomes. My colleague Nigel Timmons and I have worked on this now it's called No Easy Choice, a Humanitarian's Guide to Principled Ethical Decision Making, and it's about to come out soon. It's funded by UK FCDO, so thank you for the UK if they're in the room, through the Humanitarian Innovation Hub. But basically, it's a process to structure the thinking so that as an organization or an interagency body, you can actually identify the dilemma and start thinking about what are your options of how to deal with it. And we tested it with colleagues in Libya and in Myanmar. And some people said, we wish we had this 2 years ago. But it is actually a very useful way to just kind of, at least I think so, and they thought so too, to really just structure your thinking, but then also to document it, because then you can also go back and justify, whether it's to headquarters or your regional office or wherever, as to why that decision was taken. But then also that you go back and revisit it, because we do have turnover in the system. So if a decision is taken and 3 months later someone goes, why the hell did you do that? You actually can understand a little bit why and then revisit it. So that will be out soon, translated into several languages, and then pick it up and use it and within your organizations, adapt it, do what you want with it. But now I'm going to cede to Emmanuel because he had more substantive points as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just in 1 minute, Emmanuel, H2H Network. No, it's great to talk about trust, but perhaps before, it would be very important to discuss about relationships. And relationship between humanitarian actors, very contractual, opportunistic, competitive, unbalanced, etc. And also between humanitarian actors and civilians, because we did not talk at all yet about civilians. The reality today is a major distrust and disaffection from civil societies and civilians with regards to humanitarian enterprise. How far we are ready to think beyond humanitarian strict responses, how far we are ready to engage on the aspiration of the people on the ground, how far we are ready to denunciate authorities, as you mentioned, that's all the issues that can create a trusting environment between actors that pretend to operate on the ground and reduce suffering of people and doing it actively and really. Thank you.
Well said. I promised, well said. Azmat. Yeah.
Hi, I'm just using the mic. Thanks. In the corner. Hi, Oxfam International. I'd like also to support a lot of what's been said around what is trust and who are we talking about when we're talking about building trust with. We haven't talked a lot about our national and local partners, and building trust there with our national and local partners is also based on understanding what are the mandates and the power dynamic behind it. A lot of the international NGOs are also perceived and are simply donors and considered as such by our national and local partners. And the trust is not about trust, it is about a very transactional relationship. In the best case scenario, it is an equal partnerships, and we're all striving to do that, I'm sure, but it's not always the case. When we're talking about trust with authorities, it's not just about building trust. A lot of authorities, national as well, and militaries, do not need to trust us. They know exactly who we are, what we stand for, and they do not want us. They don't want us in the area. They don't want witnesses. I'm sure that there is no point in trusting the IDF or hoping that the IDF would trust us. They know full well who we are. They don't want us. The IDF, the Israel military in Gaza, if you're not familiar. So it's important to build trust, but it's also, I think, super important that we revisit the power dynamics in between the different actors in the field. And if we are very truthful to the humanitarian development peace nexus as well, that we build trust with other actors, with the peace actors, with the civil society, in a situation where we know the humanitarian space and the civic space is shrinking in all the context in which we are operating. I think it's important that we realize the power we have, that we hold, and ensure that we're shifting this power and making sure that we build trust in doing that as well.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take one final point from Azmat, and then we'll be wrapping up. Sorry. I realize we're almost at time.
This is Azmat Khan, and I'm working with FRD, a local organization in Pakistan. And there was this expectation in the morning that all of us, or most of us, would become a little bit uncomfortable, but so let's meet that expectation as well.
Yeah, let's do it.
The thing is, like, for trust building, we need to have communication, open communication, but with honesty. And in addition to honesty, if something has been said in a safe space, it needs to stay in that safe space. There had been an evaluation mission of a UN agency somewhere in Pakistan, and some of the FGD's representatives just talked about the World Humanitarian Summit and Grand Bargain and localization, and some of us in that room went back and communicated it to the UN agency that X and Y or Z guy is sort of trying to get funding from you for them directly. So for building a real trust, this sense of competition and competition for resources, it needs to be overcome. And so many of the friends said in their comments, this power imbalance. If the power imbalance is reduced, the sense of competition will reduce, and then we will have more safe spaces where we can trust each other and we can build on each other. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. I'm sorry, but what I'm encouraging is everybody to fill in the Mentimeter now on what can we do next. I'm afraid it's skipped. As a steering committee, I'm going to go over to Rayhan for some quick reflections too.
Sure. Thank you for all the comments and also sharing what you were talking about. Just, I think, very, very quick reactions, and I won't be able to do justice to all of them, but I wanted to pick up on one or two of the big pieces that were coming out. One on the trust and some of the last comments. I think this is where Ed joined me in that as well. Trust is a very, very strong... Trust is a very, very deep, strong, difficult word, right? I don't think that's a state we should aspire to. This is why I keep talking about repeat and consistent behavior, right? If we can have repeat and consistent behavior, we can build on it, right? And it may be that it's repeat and consistent behavior that is negative, but we still know how to navigate that and work with that, right? So just on the trust element, on the question on the inherent biases around national organizations cannot be principled, I mean, it's absolutely true, right? And it points to what I was talking to a bit about was the self-righteousness, right? At each level. Within organizations, national and local staff cannot be trusted. Headquarters cannot trust another staff because they've gone rogue, they're not going to be principled. So it just applies across the board. And I would submit here, I think part of the solution here is, again, we need to stop using it as a label and start judging it and evaluating it with its actions, right? Because otherwise we're just dealing in perceptions. Essentially, right? So how do we take this and bring evidence around it on a consistent basis? Not one study in 5 years, but this is part and parcel of how we respond, and we need to start speaking with evidence about this rather than just our notions, which are most of the times biased as well. On the last notion on accountability, that was raised as well, and I think part of that is what I was alluding to on our internal organizational structures, right? So we've talked about capacity building, but how do we shape, should staff be getting mandates and red lines when we're asking them to make decisions? What is the documentation framework, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We have these things, again, for risk, for procurement, for other things. We need to have that for this as well. So how do you structure your organization, especially when you're working at scale? In this day and age, one truck is going, an armed actor jumps on it, and there's a picture, and MDH, social media, we're gone. It takes a very, very long time to build consistent behavior and that perception, and it'll take that one tweet to take that away, right? So what is that structure that brings accountability? Not for it to be punitive, but to help also protect ourselves, right? When I now go for a negotiation, my first question is, what am I allowed to give? What can I give? When do I come back and speak to you? What is my box? And I want to know that, and I want that in writing, because later when someone comes tomorrow asking questions, I have something in my hand to say I was mandated to do this, right? Again, not ad hoc, proactive, systematic. This is a structural thing. It's not something we do just because we got in a car and we're faced with it.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your input so far, and please do keep filling them in. So we're at a moment in time as the steering committee. We're meeting tomorrow. We'll be looking at your feedback, at your inputs, and deciding the way forward. We have a number of things in development already, including with the support of SAVE, who've provided us with a consultant to collect case studies on your dilemmas anonymously, looking at the different options that you considered and what the short-term and long-term outcome of those decisions were, because this is how we can learn. And I can see the ideas of having, these case studies is on the Mentimeter. We are looking at frameworks, we're looking at trust building tools, and just to the point about trust is a big meaty word. You can break it down into components. There are behaviours that you can do, and great to hear that OCHA is working on that as well. That whole need for time for establishing a behavioral code or clear expectations at meetings that create a safe space. So are we being explicit about our expectations, about the challenges getting there? We often say, oh, this is Chatham House, but really how much time do we set with our teams, with our coordination meetings, to really spell out, this is how you show up and behave in this meeting, and this is a safe space. So do please keep filling that in and let us know, and do contact me by email and highlight your interest in the work. It would be really great to hear. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I really want to thank you for your time. I'm sorry that we didn't have as much time to hear everybody's feedback. I believe that this work is really valuable. The problems that we face as humanitarians are so grave today. We can't solve them alone. We need this collaboration. We need this support. And that means figuring out very quickly how to build a safe and effective team within and beyond our organizations. One of the members of the group said that, working with other agencies, it's not like working with a team of synchronized swimmers. We're more like a football team. We have different roles and responsibilities, but we hopefully have all the same overarching goal. We might have small mini goals ourselves, but the same overall goal of principled and effective humanitarian response. So if we're not passing the ball to each other, we're never going to score, and we're also just going to end up in a pile-up if we're anything like my 11-year-old playing football. So how we get there can take many different forms, and we're not always going to agree with each other, and we've talked about that a lot as a group. We're not always going to align, and that's okay, but we can do much better if we have these strategic conversations that are real, that we're actually listening to each other without judgment, and share our fears. So thank you all for your time today, and thank you to the panelists.